Mm. Mm.
Yes, we're live. So, good afternoon for those who are in Brazil, and good morning, good night. I don't know what are your time zones?
Evening. It's 7 p.m. now in Western Europe.
Okay. So we can I would like to give a few words before we start. This morning we received very sad news here in Brazil. The bodies of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira who have been found. They were people who were trying to fight for indigenous rights, and they were brutally murdered in the deep Amazon jungle by illegal poachers, illegal wood loggers, and illegal miners. So that's a very sad news for our country today. But anyway, we wish to make this to make this statement before, but so we are ready to start our conference today with the first presentation with contributed papers. The first paper is The Semantics of Thought Experiments by Peter Hertogh from Brussels. You are right now at Brussels?
No, I'm in Amsterdam, but I've been working for Chongqing University. I had a seminar about thought experiments for Chongqing University 2013. Then I've delivered the project at VUB Brussels, and I've been teaching after for Julien Normal University. So I teach critical thinking, debates, and philosophy. And I'm also working for LearnLight now.
Okay, good. We can start then. Please feel free. Peter, you have 25 minutes, 20 minutes.
Yeah,
or,
okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. And yeah, this performance is dedicated to Tarsila do Amaral, yeah, Abu Poru, yeah, I guess it's Topi local language for men, people, eating, and anthropophagite for swelling European culture. So I'm very interested how Brazil improves on European culture, not just about philosophy, but all culture and sciences. And this is also dedicated to Mother Nature and Father Sky. That is an African thought experiment, which Jacob Olupuna told me when he was visiting Chongqing University in 2013. And now, yeah, it will mainly focus on Western philosophy and some Chinese examples too. So my research about thought experiments, it's about identification of thought experiments, analysis of thought experiments, and interpretation of thought experiments. So you can see here division in parts of the presentation. So identification, I will tell something about philosophical figures like metaphors, where my master thesis was about, and thought experiments, PhD research, then about thought indicators, about 5 dogmas that are suspended in metaphor, about traditional and modern dichotomies that are suspended in thought experiments. Then the analysis part, surface analysis, I can say something about the act of imagination, yeah, like it has been phenomenologically investigated by Jean-Paul Sartre in L'Imaginaire. Then example, changing a beam of light, one of the thought experiments of Einstein. Then the deep structure, yeah, part model semantics of my PhD thesis. So then I will answer the question, not metaphysics and semantics of fiction, but meaning and reference of fictional entities. And the example will then be flying humanoids. Then interpretations or conclusions, and I will explain shortly the thought experiment diagram. I hope everyone has received the thought experiment diagram now. Have you all received the thought experiment diagram? Okay, yeah, then you will see on the vertical line 5 thought experiments which I will explain later on, and especially the formulas. And on the horizontal line, you will see plausibility values from 0 to 1 or from 0% to 100%. And plausibility wants to say a kind of a pragmatical notion of a probability. So how probable do you think, how plausible do you think these thought experiments are, relatively speaking? So is chasing a beam of light more probable, more plausible than the Pythagorean theorem, and so on? So I will return to it in the end of the presentation. So about thought experiments, identifications, the kernel definition is our problem-solving devices of mental tests. The necessary condition is thought experiments are mental devices. And then thought experiment indicators are words like imagine and suppose. And thought experiments together with, for instance, metaphors and philosophical figures. So mental phenomena, the ones who say thought experiments are always conducted, performed in the mind. Yeah, but then of course, philosophers write them down. So after the cognitive and linguistic turn, effect hermeneutical turn, we're now studying thought experiments as they have been written down by philosophers, like the Cogito, like chasing a beam of light. So I just study texts, but originally they were in the minds of a philosopher. So you can say our incomplete arguments are antimime. The term thought experiment was first used by Ernst Mach and Hans Christian Ørsted. Nevertheless, we distinguish thought experiments throughout the history of philosophy and science. So for instance, in pre-Euclidean mathematics, Lakatos, for instance, dichnymy, they were called dichnymy in those days. Pre-Socratic, Rescher, 1991 is about it. Iro Diacono, 2005-2011, write about invented examples in Greek antiquity. Then in Indian philosophy, Gautama's Vipassana meditation, in Taoism, Chuang's butterfly dream and happiness of fish. In the Middle Ages, King, 1991, write about obligationes, the proofs of God existence. Actually, from Aristotle can also be considered religious thought experiments, for instance, Anselm's ontological argument discussed in Vehiger, or Ibn Sina's Avicenna's flying men. Then thought experiment in Renaissance and the modern world. Yeah, actually, we think, the West think that they invented the experimental method and then especially used it from the Renaissance on. So Descartes' cogito is very famous as a thought experiment, especially Galileo's falling bodies. Yeah, many thought experiment philosophers relativize this opinion. Yeah, they say experiments and thought experiments were used throughout the history of philosophy and science and in all disciplines and cultures. But now they revive again in post-analytical philosophy and science, and that was the reason for me to write about it. For instance, Putnam's Twin Earths, Nagel's Bat, Kirk's and Chalmers' Zombies. Okay, then I will skip. That is an example of thought experiments in art, Lawrence Wiener's Declaration of Intent. Then I have added some additional categories of thought experiments, not just only philosophical and scientific thought experiments, but also literary thought experiments. For instance, philosophical novels like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Sartre's Nausea, Kipling's Just So stories, movies like Star Wars and The Matrix, types of popular culture as fairy tales, fables, myths, legends, religious stories, etc. And then the global cross-cultural thought experiments, like I've mentioned already, adding Zen koans. I've also written about koans in Japan and Huatus in Buddhism. So they are not from European culture. Philosophical figures are devices used in philosophy that nevertheless breach the dichotomy between philosophy and literature, between cognition and emotion. Because thought experiments are often told as a story, you can read them as a story, they have narratological effects, they have visual effects, they are not a formula, yeah, they are not a mathematical formula, though I think that we can reduce them to mathematical formulas. So they breach also the literature science distinction. And some people consider them unscientific, but my thesis want to propose a procedure to translate them into, let's say, philosophical logical formulas. A thought experiment indicator, like consider and imagine. In Euler's proof, for instance, let there be given. In this case, Einstein's changing beam of light is a hidden thought experiment. The 5 dogmas that are breached in metaphors is synchronicity. A metaphor we can study throughout history. It starts as a vivid metaphor, and then it may end as a proverb or a new word. For instance, time flies. Time flies is a kind of stoned metaphor now, but when it was used the first time, it was still a vivid metaphor. Then it breaches the dogma of literal and descriptive meaning. So it is metaphorical meaning is another language game, which we can say with Wittgenstein. The dogma of cognitive meaning, also emotion, imagination, intuition is playing a part in metaphors, like, for instance, Alex is a giraffe. A context-independent meaning is suspended because a vivid metaphor, a metaphor that is used for the first time, you understand from context. You cannot look up the meaning of a vivid metaphor that's used for the first time in a dictionary because it's not yet in the dictionary. So you understand the meaning of a metaphor just from the context. And then language is picture of reality. Of course, then we have to add a metaphor. A metaphor is not a direct reference, but you can say a metaphor is fitting or not fitting. So these 5 dogmas are suspended. A new example for this presentation, 8 days a week. There's a song by the Beatles. It is about love, because the context is I ain't got nothing but love, babe. So he loves her more than 7 days a week. He loves her incredibly much. So you see that in fact it's semantically a mistake. 8 days a week is just wrong, semantically wrong, but it gets a metaphorical meaning. It wants to say he loves her very, very much. And maybe it's derived from working 8 days a week. So it's an example of context-dependent metaphor. Then the traditional and modern dichotomies that are breached. Some people say thought experiments are contradictio in terminis, because one word thought comes from rationalism, and the other word experiment comes from empiricism. So that's correct. So it's breaching indeed this traditional dichotomy. And next, it breaches again dichotomy between cognition and emotion, or philosophy and literature, because it's like a story. It breaches the distinction between phenomenology and analytical philosophy. I will show analytical analysis, but these 2 streams were contradictory in the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century. And now you can unite them to analyze one phenomenon. Then it breaches the distinction between popular and science context. Especially Einstein uses thought experiment to reach a general public. For instance, he has many thought experiments in the evolution of physics by Einstein and Infeld. And then it breaches fact-value distinction in ethical thought experiments, like the prisoner's dilemma. So, yes, the act of imagination. This is the surface structure of especially chasing a beam of light. Phenomenologically speaking, thought experiments have a double structure. As a thought experimenter can be both the imaginer and the imagined personage of a thought experiment. It justifies semiotic, literary, narratological analysis of thought experiments, where one may analogously distinguish between an author or a hidden narrator and a viewpoint character that may have limited knowledge, omniscient knowledge, or multiple knowledge. Sorensen, also another thought experiment philosopher, has also written about the same feature of thought experiments. Now, Sartre has written L'Imaginaire, phenomenological analysis of the imagination. And he says about the theory, so we shall ignore theories. We want to know nothing about the image, but what reflection can teach us. Later on, we shall attempt, as do other psychologists, to classify the consciousness of the image among the other types of consciousness. especially distinguishes the consciousness of imagination from the consciousness of perception and the consciousness of conception. And very important here is that the daily perception is different from the perception as it appears to us in dreams, for instance, in imagination. Yeah, in the imagination, the laws of physics are bent by our imagination. So this is a very big difference. For instance, if you imagine the elephants, yeah, then you can ask questions about it, and you can ask them, what color does the elephant have? What is the size of the elephant? And it's very well possible you can't answer the later questions because you only have a very vague image of an elephant that is produced by your imagination. So it's not really comparable to an image of an elephant which you perceive at a certain moment, but because then you can exactly tell all the properties from this image. So it's an image that also changes along with your active imagination. So there's a very important difference between a perception in dreams, perception in imagination, and perception in reality. Now, chasing a beam of light. There are 3 accounts of the thought experiment. Einstein has never published about it. He has only told about it. And for instance, he told, after 10 years of reflection, such a principle resulted from a paradox upon which I had already hit at the age of 16. If I pursue a beam of light with a velocity c, the velocity of light in vacuum, I should observe such a beam of light as a spatially oscillatory electromagnetic field at rest. However, there seems to be no such thing. So he also considered a paradox thought experiment, like we consider a paradox thought experiment in our analysis, but we have simplified a little bit because you may not know about Maxwell's equations. So you can simplify like this. We have again the ambiguity of the act of imagination. There is O in the internal observer, that is Einstein flying on a beam of light. And then the external observer is Einstein standing on the surface of the Earth, imagining exactly the internal observer flying on a beam of light. We can also say the frame of reference of the internal observer, the frame of reference of the external observer. And so it's the same, this ambiguity also at work in direct and indirect speech patterns. So we can say, I say that I ride on a beam of light, I must be traveling with the speed of light. Or I say, quotation opening, if I ride on a beam of light, I must be traveling with the speed of light. So you see there are 2 I's here. Yeah, the I of the main clause and the I of the subclause, the imaginer and the imagined personage. And in the case of the thought experiments by Einstein, we can say internal observer, external observer. There are more dream thought experiments. You know, Einstein was known for daydreaming, but also Zhuangzi has made a Taoist philosopher, which the second Taoist philosopher after Lao Tzu has made the thought experiment butterfly dream, and Martin Luther King, I have a dream, I've also analyzed as a sociological thought experiment. Okay, so now maybe we can take a look at Sorensen's view as well. Yeah, Sorensen talks about the immigration of the supposition operator. The difference related to where I was talking about external supposition SBP, suppose you bring about P, and internal supposition BSP, bring it about that you suppose P. So these things can be confused in thought experiment, but then especially we have to imagine ourselves in it as well. The imaginer has also been part of the thought experiment in some kind of analysis. So it is one thing to imagine a tree in an uninhabited forest, and another thing to imagine myself discreetly viewing a tree in an otherwise uninhabited forest. So I'm using the same formulas. We can say BSP is imagine a tree in an uninhabited forest, and SP imagine myself discreetly viewing a tree in an otherwise uninhabited forest. So here now we have to include the imaginer as well, and then you get the narratological ambiguity we were talking about. Well, this is actually a problem of self-reference, yeah, which is at play too in philosophical problems as the liar. For instance, if we name as the Cretan says all Cretans are liars, here again there's a tension between the subject of the main clause and the subject of the repeated, reported speech. Okay, then we can summarize this thought experiment like the frame of reference of the internal observer or the frame of reference of the external observer are the same when it is about the application of the laws of physics. So the laws of physics are the same for someone flying with the speed of light c and someone standing on the surface of the earth. And that's the principle of relativity. And it's very important in understanding how physics developed from Newton to Einstein, as well as the velocity of light in motion. Yeah, and because Einstein is flying with the speed of light and the speed of light is constant, it is an inertial coordination system, and the principle of relativity applies. Next, then, the last part, the deep structure model semantics, we use Kripke's frame semantics, is a triple set of worlds, accessibility relation, and a satisfaction or truth relation. And then we can consider the example of flying human or flying humanoid, which exists in different cultures. Yeah, because in Indian culture, we can imagine it as a fakir on a carpet. In Chinese culture, they fly with help of sea, is a kind of energy, and in Western culture, they can fly with help of wings. But it's the same concept. Man was always obsessed by the desire to fly. So flying humanoids exist in all the fables, myths, fairy tales, and so on. We can analyze it like this. We can say all these images, yeah, are part of the objective imagination. So that's the total of particularly mass-produced products that constitute popular and academic imagery and conceptual schemes, set of beliefs in a culture. For instance, so the different images of flying men. This is derived from Walter Benjamin, the work of art in the age of mechanical mass production. Yeah, of course, those images exist from old days, but nowadays they are all mass produced, and you can find the image of a fakir as easy as an image of a city, for instance. Now we can symbolize it like this. Suppose a triple of a set of possible worlds, accessibility relation, satisfaction, truth relation. W0 is the actual world, the Galilean Newtonian world. Phi is a proposition variable, meta language true and false. Then this formula says in the actual world, Phi exists is true, or in the actual world, Phi doesn't exist is not true. And then for flying humanoids, we can use another possible world, the possible world of fictional entities, for instance, called W1. And next, we can call the same world objective imagination. So in the world of objective imagination, there exists flying humanoids. But we can see here, flying humanoids don't exist in the actual world. So it is a way using possible world semantics to analyze logically fictional entities. Another example in the thought experiment diagram, Chang'e. Yeah, Chang'e, everyone knows in China. She is celebrated during the autumn festival when everyone is looking at the moon and giving each other mooncakes. Chang'e is a divine princess living on the moon, a Taoist princess living on the moon. So I formalize like this. Chang'e is again a mythical person. So she's part of objective imagination. And we can say about her, A is Chang'e, A is a princess, and A is living on the moon. So that's another example how you can formalize mythical fictional entities with help of model logic and predicate logic. You can complete the thought experiment diagram in a PDF reader, which you can download if you don't have it yet from getadobe.com reader, or you can also use an online editor to add your choices to the Soderman diagram. Yeah, for instance, to say, I think that the pictorial theorem is less plausible or more plausible than chasing a beam of light. There's a picture of Chang'e, and that's it. Are there any questions about this? I can take a look at the references as well, but I've already mentioned a lot of thought experiment philosophers like King and Sorensen. There's a lot of literature about thought experiments, and so there's a revival of thought experiment in post-analytical philosophy. But this thesis is really about thought experiments all throughout the history of philosophy and science, including fiction.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for your presentation. We have questions. We have a first question from Nate.
Hi, thank you, Peter, for the very interesting talk. I'm wondering, do you think you need to distinguish in your modal semantics or in some way philosophical thought experiments from scientific ones? So Einstein's thought experiments are empirically testable, or at least they give empirical results. And Putnam's Twin Earth, though I love the thought experiment, and Descartes' Cogito, all the others, they arguably don't give empirical results. And I raise the question because perhaps you know Daniel Dennett is a US philosopher who worries that thought experiments in philosophy are actually intuition pumps. They encourage us to answer a certain way because they distort our way of thinking. And in science, we have a check. In philosophy, we don't. So that's my question.
Yeah, indeed, the scientific thought experiments are only accepted if they have been confirmed by a scientific experiment. Yeah, that's indeed how science works. So, for instance, a lot of theories of Einstein are not yet completely accepted, or there are variations about it made by other philosophers and scientists. But the solar eclipse experiments, are sometimes mentioned as really proof that light is bending. Though Einstein have been writing about it, they only believe it when it is approved in an external experiment. So indeed, the thought experiments are questions, if they really have some use. But I guess that the cogito of Descartes is not only about intuition, or maybe it's also about intuition, but it may prove that we really exist because we are thinking. And I guess that's a very good anti-skeptical argument. And I hold that thought experiment is an etymeme, as Aristotle says. So it's an unfinished thought experiment, an unfinished argument. And if you look carefully, then you can make the argument valid. Yeah, for instance, by revealing, that's also what the abstract says, by revealing principles and presuppositions, etc. So the presupposition.
I'm sorry, can I ask just one follow-up to clarify just a little bit? So the worry is that philosophical thought experiments depend on what we can imagine. And we can imagine some things, not some things. Historically, some people could imagine nobody traveling faster than, 50 kilometers per hour, but today we can. We can't imagine, a mind separate from a body. Descartes says we can, I can't. But in science, it's not just about imagination, it's about empirical results. So that's why I'm wondering if you need to distinguish in your work, if you think your argument actually shows that one is better than the other. Just what are your thoughts?
Now, thought experiments are used in a lot of less ambitious fields than what I'm talking about. So, for instance, you can use a thought experiment in conceptual analysis. If you talk about a liar, then you have a lot of supposition. Every supposition you have, every philosophical supposition you make is in fact a thought experiment. So then you can really say that thought experiments are everywhere. But now, if you are talking about the great thought experiments, and indeed it's true in science, they have the reality check. But in philosophy, we don't really have a reality check. So we can't say we only accept philosophical thought experiment if it is tested against reality. So they don't have a reality check in philosophy, and that's why people may be more free to imagine and to think in philosophy than in science. But a lot of philosophical thought experiments have meanwhile been confirmed by science. Yeah, but we can be sure now that the mind exists. Yeah, there's activity in brain scan. Yeah, it's not only an illusion. So I guess at the moment we can be sure that that mind exists, and we can be sure about cognitive science. So I guess then it is too skeptical. Too skeptical about if the mind exists. Yeah, nowadays we also think that animals have consciousness. Yeah, of course, it's about how to define consciousness. You can talk about the consciousness of a thermostat and also talk about the consciousness of enlightened persons. So then actually about how you define consciousness. But at the moment, I guess everyone may admit that animals have consciousness because there are animal rights nowadays. While you can still skeptical doubt if consciousness of animals exists. Yeah, some philosophical thought experiments are going far beyond what's going on in the actual world. Yeah, and I guess so. The check for philosophy can be the actual world. Yeah, you cannot be very cruel to animals and saying, well, I doubt that animals have consciousness. Yeah, you have to live in an actual world. You have to live with human rights. You cannot do things that are very far beyond what is usual in the ordinary world. So we are actually checked by the ordinary world, I guess, by the daily living world. Somehow. So in the example of animal consciousness.
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry.
Yeah, Schrödinger's cat is an example. Yeah, what happens to a cat, etc. In fact, it's a very cruel thought experiment.
Okay,
it's about a cat being killed in the thought experiment, and
yes.
And I say from the point of view of animal rights, you can say, can't you imagine a better thought experiment that will say the same thing?
Sorry to interrupt. We are short on time here. I would ask, sorry, Julia, we still have a question from Julia. Julia, do you mind asking at the end of the session? No problem, okay. Or you can still continue the conversation via chat if you want. I see that there's a question on the chat. So no problem. And we can, once again, thank you, Peter, for your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, I especially hope that you may take 1 minute trying to complete the thought experiment diagram. Yeah, if you're not familiar with PDF, it's difficult, but I guess you will be familiar with PDFs, and then you can send it to my email address, which is neuromicro2005@gmail.com.
Sure, yes. I've shared via chat with the other participants.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you. We have now José Carlos Camillo. Please try sharing your slides if you have.
Okay. Let me try. Are you seeing the screen?
Yes.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
José Carlos Camillo, who is a PhD candidate, right? At the Universidade Federal de Goiás, will present us with a paper, What's the Name of the Rose? An Enactivist Ecological Approach for Interpreting Fictional Meaning. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So I'm gonna talk about this enactivist and ecological approach to interpreting fictional meaning. I would start with this study case from The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, but I will skip that due to time reasons. So what I'm gonna present here is an activist account of interpretation for fictional meaning. First, I will introduce what I mean by fictional meaning. Then I will present an activism and the notion of participatory sense-making. Then I will talk about the recipient supremacy thesis and give some reasons why you should reject recipient supremacy thesis. And finally, I will present an activist and ecological approach for this kind of interpretation. So what I mean by fictional meaning is not the meaning of particular words or sentences in a fictional work, but I mean how we can understand the themes that the fiction has brought up through the story. More specifically, how sentences, characters, the plot, the events of the story contribute for us to understand how these themes are dealt with in the story. So most of the time I will talk about novels and fictional writing, but it could work as well for movies and TV shows and any kind of fictional work, etc. So for the activism, basic cognition does not represent, so it does not have a content. Cognition emerges as the interaction between a body, an organism, and the environment. And this interaction goes via actions. And an organism is a self-organized system that tries to keep its identity. So it tries to prevent itself to being dissolved in the environment. And to do so, they need to react to the environment, to interact with the environment with some values. Like there are situations in the environment that are positive for their organism, and there are situations in the environment that are negative for the organism. So through these different kinds of situation, the interactions acquire meaning. So that's what enactivists call sense making. They produce meaning, they produce sense through this kind of interaction. And when we are interacting with different bodies, especially with bodies of our own species, so a dog with a dog and a human person with another human person, organisms tend to coordinate their actions. So it's interesting how you come to a class or to an auditory full of people, and you tend to follow what the others are doing somehow, and this makes that the organisms, the bodies, the agents produce, or the sense making they are producing, the sense that they are making become coordinated as well. So this is what it's called participatory sense making. The producing of sense, the producing of meaning becomes shared by the interactors in this kind of social interaction. But there are situations when one of the interactors has more authority over the coordination of the interaction. So the interaction is like oriented by this a particular interactor. Like in a presentation like this one person talks and the other listens, and in the final we have the Q&A section, and there are interaction, there are the meaning is produced through a participatory way, but one of the persons, one of the people has more participation on this producing of meaning. So we have this spectrum between this individual sense making that is coordinated by dynamics of social interaction, and we have other kinds of participatory sense making that are joint sense making, because all of the persons, all of the interactors contribute almost equally to the producing of meaning, to the producing of sense in that situation. For example, I give here the example of playing that kids do, that is miming. So one of the kids have to mime some kind of animal, some kind of the name of a movie or something like that. And the others have to guess what is being mimed by the person in the center of the group. It may seem that the person at the center has more authority over the participatory sense making, but actually the person also responds to the reaction of the others and changes its own way of producing the sense according to what others are saying. And other thing that is important to highlight here is that social rules rule this kind of interactions. For example, in the miming game, the person cannot talk. The person can make the number of words that will be mimed in the game. Can say through gestures what word they will mime first, and things like that. So we have some habits, social habits that tell us how to play a mime game, and we follow this social rules. So understanding may emerge from these interactions, from this situation, and from this background, Caracciolo. I'm sorry, let me put you. Caracciolo defends that in case of fictions, the recipient has the greatest contribution to the meaning of fiction. He gives us the example of metamorphosis and how different people understand the book differently. And he says that it's not wrong because we don't have a final meaning of the book, and the recipient, the reader, has the final word over the meaning of the book. So we have different meanings, different interpretations, because for him, when we have this kind of interaction with a book, the authority, the supremacy, the greatest authority over the producing of sense, the producing of meaning, is relies on the recipient, on the reader. So the reader has the supremacy over the meaning of any kind of fictional work. And he gives us some arguments, some reasons for thinking that. The first one is that in fiction, many of the things are intentionally indeterminate. And when things are indeterminate in fiction, the recipient tends to create the meaning of that thing that is indeterminate. For example, the name of the rose, that is the title of the book by Umberto Eco. The author intentionally chose a title that is indeterminate. The meaning of the title, the connection between the story and the title, it has not just one way of connection or just one meaning, and it was intentionally built this way. So because of this indeterminacy, the recipient has the final meaning, has the supremacy over the meaning of a fictional work. Besides that, he will argue that the absence of the producer of the fictional work in the moment that the recipient takes the work to read or to watch or to listen, makes some features, other features of the work that were not intentionally indeterminate. They become indeterminate because we don't have this direct interaction with the producer, like in the mime gaming. The producer, the person who is miming, responds to other people's reactions, but the authors of a fiction cannot respond to other people's reactions because he's not there to see the reaction of the recipients. And besides that, we have a temporal and cultural distance from the producer to the recipient that also contributes to our work's indeterminacy. In the final conclusion of Caracciolo is that because of this indeterminacy, there is intrinsical, there is really an essence of the fictional work itself. The recipient has the supremacy over the meaning of a fictional work. Okay, I will give you 2 reasons for rejecting the recipient supremacy thesis. The first reason is that the producer's intention limits the reader's interpretation. So 2 situations in which this happens. The first one is when one misinterprets the fictional feature of the work itself. So here in Brazil, we have a famous telenovela called Senhora do Destino. I think it's like Lady of the Destiny in English, in which we had this villain who was super evil called Nazaré Tedesco. She even became a meme in the internet. And she was interpreted by a Brazilian actress called Renata Sorrah. And one day, Renata Sorrah was walking in the street, in the sidewalk, and a lady took an umbrella and starts to beat Renata Sorrah and saying bad things about her and saying you have to be arrested and something like that. And that happened because the recipient, this lady who was watching the telenovela, couldn't understand that it was a fiction. It was not a real story. And she mistook Renata Sorrah by a real person or a real, that she really did the bad things that she did in the telenovela. So this happened because the lady misinterpreted the fictional feature, and this fictional feature comes from the producer's intention. It is only possible to misinterpret something if the reader has not the final word of this thing. The other kind of situation is when you misinterpret the fictional message. Okay, messages in fiction tend to be childish, but there are some kind of fictional works that have messages, and it's possible to mistake these messages as well. And it's also it's only possible to mistake these messages because the reader has not the final word over the fictional meaning. And the second line of argument that I'm using is that, okay, I'm going back quickly here, is that, as I said before, social habits rule the interactions, so rule this participatory sense making. And at least here in Western, we tend to emphasize authors' intention. So we have interviews with authors in which we ask them to explain some parts of their fictional works. So it happened a lot with George R. R. Martin, who was the author of Game of Thrones TV show, and it also is not. It was not a. It was not an exception. It also it actually is the rule that we try to find what is the author's intention. It's a social habit, so it tends to rule how we interpret fictional works. Okay, so rejecting the recipient supremacy thesis, my proposal is that when we is to couple ecological psychology with enactivism. Enactivism, to be sure, was highly influenced by ecological psychology. And for ecological psychology, the interaction happens because we have environmental constraints and bodily constraints. So both constraints allow interaction to happen in certain ways. So my proposal is that interpretation of fictional works happens when we take two kinds of constraints, but we have to keep in mind some things that make fictional works opened for producing of meaning. So we have the producer sense making and the recipient sense making, and this both kinds of producing of meaning are interacting with each other, and how they limit each other will lead us to the best interpretations of fictional works. So we have in this situation 4 features that contribute to meanings production. The first one is the author's intention that limits the meaning possibilities. The second one is the reader's submission to the author's intention. So when you start reading a book, especially a fictional work, you don't, at least it's not my case, and we have empirical evidence that people tend to do that. We tend to follow what the author is presenting to us. It's not like when I'm reading a philosophical work that I'm trying to find the flaws of the argument or something like that. I'm following the author's intention, and I'm submitting myself to the author's intention when I take a fictional work. But beside these two situations that limit the scope of meaning possibilities, we have 2 things that opens the possibilities of meanings. The first one is the indeterminacy that Caracciolo showed us. The absence of the author, the cultural distance, and the intentional indeterminacy make some features of the fictional works open to different interpretations. And we have also the reader's background. So how the reader approaches how the reader is when he approaches to the fictional works will also influences how he understands the fictional works and the fictional work, and not only in a bad way, it could be also a good way. So the reader can bring something more to the fiction because of their background. So basically is that I'm still working on it, but that's my main argument was to disprove the recipient supremacy thesis and to initially present this enactivist and ecological proposal here. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, José Carlos, for your talk. So, do we have questions? I can start with a question, perhaps. I wonder if we can actively refuse to collaborate in producing meaning with a work of fiction and still have something come out of it. Like, for example, there was a book that I was reading. I will not remember the name right now, but I was not invested in the fiction. I wasn't following along with the intentions of the author, but I was more or less reading just to see what would the outcome of the story be, and so on. So I wonder if you would allow that some kind of meaning is created, even in the absence of collaboration, even if we resist collaborating. Would you say that meaning is produced?
Okay, I believe that yes. The answer would be yes. And it would be a collaborative, participatory sense making in this sense, because you are somehow drawing from the fictional work in something that was not the intention of the author, or even, I don't know, you read one single word and you started to imagine something from that single word that was not the intention of the author. So it's possible, but I'm not. It's some kind of producing of meaning. You are producing meaning, but I wouldn't call it interpreting the fictional work. I'm highly influenced by Umberto Eco, and he puts two things differently. He says of interpreting fiction, and he says of using fiction. You have when you are interpreting fiction, you have to follow this kind of rules that I presented there. I believe they are fair rules, but you can use the fictional work for your own intentions that do not respect the text itself or the author's intention or anything like that. For example, I would give this example, but I skip for matter of time. When last year Netflix launched the movie Don't Look Up with Leonardo DiCaprio and etc. And the movie is about scientists warning the government about a catastrophe. So, and at least it seems that it is a book, it's a movie about scientists warning about the climate change and the climate catastrophe, etc. It seems. Here in Brazil, most of people watched the movie and saw it as a criticism to Bolsonaro's government because he didn't listen to the scientists' warnings about the COVID-19 and etc. And I think it's a fair interpretation, to be honest. But I've listened a pastor saying that the movie was about pastors warning people about Jesus' second coming. And I think this doesn't respect the author's intention or even the movie itself, but the pastor used and created sense and created meaning using the fictional work, but I wouldn't call it interpretation. So I don't know if it makes sense, but that's it.
Yes, great, thanks. Do we have more questions? Yes, Julia, please.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. This is just something that had occurred to me while I was listening to you. I think your view about how social habits underpin an author's intention is actually really insightful and key. And I think this because I'm somewhat reminded of Robert Brandon's Making It Explicit, where he talks in the beginning about like infinite regresses and rule following. Because if we don't have like a kind of system of rules to which we can engage with an interlocutor, I guess in this case, we don't really have one, but we have social habits to which we can adhere to, then we can avoid this kind of regress. So maybe that's something to think about, but that's just something that occurred to me while I was listening to you. But thank you nonetheless for your presentation.
Well, thanks for the comment. I really appreciate it. And I really agree with you. So thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions? If not, Iago, are you ready?
Never.
Never.
Can everyone hear me well?
Yes.
So I'll start sharing.
So let me present Iago Mello Batistela, who is, oh, sorry. First of all, thank you once again, José Carlos, for your presentation. Thank you for your questions, Julia. So Iago Mello Batistela, or any permutation thereof, is he's a PhD candidate at Unicamp, Universidade de Campinas, and he will present the talk Asserting and Lying in Works of Fiction.
Okay, thank you, José. Thank you, Italo, for inviting me, or actually for accepting my work in a last hour thing. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, so I'll start. So here's the outline of my presentation. I will talk all about intention, nothing about meaning, actually. So I will present the following topics. First, I will try to present fiction as fiction making as a speech act. Then I'll present two views on fictions and assertion. I will talk about fiction, lying, and assertion. So, and this will be a quick outline about patchwork approaches and dual act approaches, but I will not delve deep in these topics. And then I will present an argument against the idea that we have assertions in works of fiction. And I will talk a little about factual information in fiction without asserting something. So in this presentation, I will not propose a definition for fiction. I will not debate the existence of fictional objects, and I will not discuss any aesthetic merits of this or that work, which are some stuff that can be confused with the first topics that I will talk about. So what is to take fiction as a speech act? So speech act theories of fiction characterize the act of fiction making as constituted by a sui generis illocutionary force. In this work, I will assume a Gricean account of speech acts of fiction making, and the speech act will be construed as an expression of the intention to raise a certain imaginative endeavor in the reader of a fictional work in relation to the content of what was written or said in the performance of the act by the author of that work. It will go somewhat like this. Take S to be a sentence in a fictional work and P to be the content expressed by that utterance of S. In the process of writing a work of fiction, the author of S expresses that P is true in fiction, that he takes P to be true in fiction, and the intention that the reader imagines that P. So there are two views that relate assertion and fiction making in works of fiction. Both argue that most works of fiction do not seem to be composed of only acts of fiction making. It's widely accepted that assertions are also part of works of fiction. And the common example is the idea of, is usually presented in this way, like with Tolstoy's first sentence in Anna Karenina, which is the sentence that happy families are all alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And to contrast it, I presented you with the second sentence of Anna Karenina, where that is, everything was confusion in the Oblonsky's house. So what utterances like two are only acts of fiction making or related to acts of fiction making, utterances like one are usually taken to be assertions. So here are the two approaches. There are two main treatments to the relation between fiction making and assertions in works of fiction. I call them patchwork approaches and dual act approaches, but I will not delve too deep in this topic. So patchwork approaches assume that a work of fiction is composed by two speech acts, fiction making and assertion, and passages like one are assertion, while passages like two are fiction making. And dual act approaches argue that a work of fiction is composed of at least, again, two speech acts, fiction making and assertion, and passages like one are both acts of fiction making and assertion in the same utterance. I will argue against both approaches. I will argue against the idea that we have assertions in works of fiction. So what is the reason to accept that we have assertions in works of fiction? On statements like one, friend points the following. I really like this passage. The statement meets all the standard requirements on sincere assertions, so denying that it is an assertion because it occurs within a work of fiction will be just backing the question. So I will back the question and deny that statements like one are assertions. And while sincere assertions could be part of work of fiction, I don't deny this, it is common sense to consider that works of fiction are free from lies, from insincere assertions. And I will argue that without a direct access to the author's belief, it is impossible to determine if an assertion in a work of fiction is sincere or insincere. So consequently, the reader can never be secure inferring the communicative intention or the illocutionary force associated with the so-called assertion in a work of fiction. So my argument goes as follows. Take S to be a so-called assertion in a fictional work. A statement of S is a successful assertion only if it is a sincere assertion in a work of fiction. So without a direct access to the author's belief, we can never know if S is a sincere assertion. If so, the author's intentions are never overt in relation to the author of S. We never know if he's fiction making or asserting. And communicative intentions are always overt intentions. So we conclude that a statement S can never be a successful assertion in a work of fiction. Everything okay? Okay. You can hear me? Okay. So, so I will argue for what I think to be the contentious premises in my argument. So premise one is anchored in the common sense intuition that there are no lies in works of fiction. And as a background, this premise assumes the following definition for lying, that A lies to B if there is a proposition P such that A asserts that P to B and A believes that P is false. That is, lying is making an insincere act of asserting. So this is a general characterization. This general characterization of lying is broadly accepted. So insincere assertions or lying are assertions of disbelieved information. This is the background assumption that I'm making to make my argument. So common sense dictates, but not only common sense, there are literature about this, that if a piece of information conveyed by an author of a work of fiction is false or disbelieved by the author should not be taken as lying, as matters of true, falsity, and if the information is part of the author's belief, should not interfere with the construction of the fictional world. That is, if the author does not believe if the information is false or something like that, it doesn't matter. It is still part of the construction of the fictional world. That is a reason why people only assume that sincere assertions are part of works of fiction. No one argues that insincere assertion or lies are parts of works of fiction. Lies are usually said to be some other thing. So here we go. I will define assertion in Gracian terms, as I'm working with a Gracian speech act theory of fiction. In Gracian terms, it's usually characterized as follow. Take S to be a sentence and P to be the content expressed by that sentence, but by an utterance of that sentence. So in the process of writing a work of fiction, the author of S expresses a belief that P and the intention that the reader believes that P. That is, when the author does this, he's asserting in a work of fiction. That's what it means to assert in a work of fiction. So as there are no insincere assertions in works of fiction, the utterance will be assertion of P, only if it is believed by the author in fact, only if the author believes that P is the case. So again, without direct access to the author's belief, we may never know if the speech act is sincere or insincere. We can never know if the author believes or disbelieves the content of his or her utterance, as there is nothing in neurolinguistic practices that guarantees sincerity. Sincerity is often assumed for the sake of a greater communicative goal in communicative practices. So it's not an overt aspect of speech acts. So the problem becomes guessing covert or overt intentions in this case. So overtness of intention is an important part of performing and recognizing a speech act. A successful speech act is one which the uptake occurs in accord to the speaker's intention. That's a broadly Gricean definition of what it means to make a speech act. So the audience shouldn't guess the intention of the speaker. The intention of the utterance is made overt, and the audience recognize it. It's not a shot in the dark. The audience uptakes what is said and recognizes the author's intention. That's what means to make a speech act in broadly Gricean terms. So every candidate assertion put forward by the author of a work of fiction would require a guess by the reader. That's my whole point. The reader cannot be sure if the recognized intention is right, if it is a sincere assertion or simply an assertion, or an act of fiction making if it is an insincere assertion. So the intention to raise belief, that's my whole point, that the intention to raise beliefs hardly seems something overt in fictional works. And uncertainty of sincerity is not a problem for day-to-day conversation, as performing or recognizing an assertion, be it sincere or insincere, are part of the same process, but it is a problem for speech act theories of fiction, as performing and recognizing a sincere assertion is quite distinct from performing and recognizing an act of fiction making, as they are two distinct communicative intentions. So I will talk a little about factual information without assertion, which is part of my promise. So I do not deny the initial intuition behind Friend's remarks or Sorrell's remarks, that behind the defense that there are of assertions in works of fiction. Some utterances do in fact seem to check most boxes for sincere assertions. Some authors do express beliefs in works of fiction, and some of those beliefs are to be believed by the readers. But I argue, however, that the process of recognizing this communicative intention can never be taken as secure. It seems that assertions in fictional works can at best be unsuccessful, as the recognition of such speech act is at best a shot in the dark. That's my whole point in this presentation. This again does not preclude the author from believing the content of his speech acts, nor that he intends that his audience came to believe what he said. My point is that the intention that the reader acquire the belief in the content of an act of fiction making can at best be a perlocutionary intention, not a illocutionary intention. It is a consequence of the way the author weaved his novel or his work of fiction that the reader come to believe what he wrote, and not an illocutionary intention that the author had when he was writing his work of fiction. So let's go back to Tolstoy and what Tolstoy actually believed. I talked to him earlier, and he said to me that we can never be sure if he actually believed that all unhappy families are distinct from each other and all happy families are alike. So, but we can guess through the imaginary that he presented in his writing that he actually did believe that thing. So, but no, nonetheless, he could be simply setting a tone for his novel. Even if he did not want us to believe that all unhappy families are that way, he certainly wanted us to take it as a part of the story. So I take this passage from Lamarck and Olson's book. It encompasses what I'm trying to say. It is a good passage. The point is that the literary function of the sentence has little or nothing to do with trying to induce a belief in a reader about happy or unhappy families. It has far more to do with an initial characterization of a theme which gives focus and interest to the fictional content. That is, it is an act of fiction making. Tolstoy intended us to imagine that unhappy families are all distinct and happy families are all alike. He was setting a tone for his novel. But we could also believe that thing. Truth in fiction and truth are compatible. They're not incompatible. You can imagine something and believe that's something that you imagine. So my point is that in failing to raise a belief regarding one, Tolstoy may not achieve one of the desirable effects of his utterance. He could be intending that we believe that. But in failing to raise imagination, Tolstoy's utterances fails to engage the reader with the information he was providing. So he fails his illocutionary intention. His utterance was not successful in engaging us with his novel, his work of fiction. That's my whole point. So I will talk a little about fiction making in non-fictional works, because sometimes it gets a little confusing about this thing. Actually, I maybe have given the talk a little too fast, because this is the last slide. So fiction making, nonetheless, is not a speech like reserved just for works of fiction. Given the characterization that I provided, any utterances which express and prescribes imagination can be an act of fiction making. So there can be acts of fiction making in academic journals, usually talked in form of thought experiments. I know it's a little contentious, but I will take it to be fiction, or in newspapers, which is one of Stacy Friend's famous examples, and I kind of agree with her, but again, it's a contentious example in the characterization of some counterfactual situations in newspapers. The problem with assertion in fictional works is not raised by the presence of an act of fiction making. So it's not fiction making that make assertion impossible to recognize. It is the medium, the fiction in which these acts of fiction making are performed. The problem is fiction, not fiction making. So assertions in fiction are problematic because works of fiction are ultimately an unreliable source of testimony or an unreliable source to access the beliefs of who's making some utterance. So unlike works of fiction, nothing precludes insincere assertions from being part of academic journals or newspapers. So fiction making can coexist with assertions in such mediums, but fiction making cannot coexist with assertions in works of fiction. That's my whole point. I don't know if it was clear. I hope so. So see you all at the bar one day, I hope. So thank you very much. My references.
Thank you, Iago.
I am sorry, I think I spoke too fast, but I was kind of nervous about time control. This was the last time thing.
Sorry if I made other people rush before.
No, it was the problem with I was a little contentious about presenting this presentation. It worked out fine, I think.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions. Italo?
Hi, Iago. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was awesome, and it's good to have you here. I'm going to be fast because there are a lot of people raising hands, so I don't want to take your time. But I have two quick questions. The first is the following. What if we knew the author's intention? For example, let's take, I read this book like a month ago. Let's take Toni Morrison's Beloved. It is a book that it was made for us to understand that racism is a bad thing, among other things. If we have means to recognize the author's intention, does that mean that we have assertions in fiction? Or even in those cases where we know that the author is being sincere, there are no such things as assertions in fiction? And my second question is that you mentioned Tolstoy, which is quite interesting because Tolstoy is known to be one of those writers that wanted the readers to become better people after reading his books. He wanted them to engage in ethics, his particular sort of Christianity and those things. And in that case, if there are no assertions in fiction, can I say that the sentences, the fictional sentences, don't express prepositions? And if that is the case, how is it possible, if it really is, for us to acquire knowledge through fiction? And once again, thank you very much. And it was really great hearing you.
Okay, let's go in parts. First, I will talk about some broadly aspect about deception. Even if we know something, we never have direct access to something about other people's intention. We can never have we can never be completely secure about deception or non-deception. And this is my whole point, because a sincere assertion requires that we're not being there's no deception. So as we can never be sure about the illocutionary intention. So this is my point. We can never being sure. Our best bet is always to bet that it was not an assertion, it's an act of fiction making. And I think this is by far the most obvious bet, because it is obvious that if a sentence is in a work of fiction, we are somewhat intended to be imagined or to take that content as part of the work of fiction. So this again does not preclude knowledge or something like that, because you can have secondary intentions. I can tell you, I don't know, I can make you a question in order to raise a belief in you, in order to teach you something. It doesn't need to be an assertion, but the illocutionary point, I choose a horrible Searlean terminology, the main point of asking a question is not to raise knowledge or to raise belief in someone, it's to simply ask for something to be answered or something like that. So I don't think it precludes us from acquiring knowledge from fiction, and I don't think knowing the author's intention will make the bet in assertion the best bet. It is still fiction making. I think that's it. About propositions, I don't know. I'm not thinking about propositions anymore. I abandoned semantics. I'm full on pragmatics nowadays. But thank you for the answer. It's always good to talk to you about those things.
Okay, Nate.
Iago, thank you. I'm going to hold you to getting a drink at a bar someday. So I want to press on, I guess, the same point that was just raised and ask, can't we sometimes determine after the fact that authors were lying to us? In particular, isn't that what always happens during cases of retcons? So I have one in particular near and dear to my heart. Didn't George Lucas lie to us? Can't we know that he lied to us when he had Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope tell Luke that Vader had killed his father? Because after all, George Lucas has Obi-Wan tell the truth, right, in Return of the Jedi, when he explains, well, what I said was true only from a certain point of view. So don't we know in cases like that there was a lie on the part of George Lucas as scriptwriter? Because the lie is later revealed.
Yep. Actually, in those cases, I think it will not fit my definition of lying, because it will fit talking about fictional characters or making fictional characters do stuff. It's usually fiction making, and I'm trying to define lie in terms of assertion. It will be an insincere act of fiction making.
So how about it? I see. So I guess my other worry is, isn't that begging the question? Because I kind of want to say, internal to the story, Obi-Wan was lying to Luke. And that seems uncontroversial, I think.
Yeah.
That internal to the story he was. But you don't want the character's perspective to be relevant. You only want the author's perspective to be relevant.
Yeah. Actually, my PhD is about this intersection between what the character does and what the author is doing. In my opinion, or actually what I'm trying to defend, is that acts of fiction making are akin to speech reports. So the actor fiction makes that a character asserts something, or the author fiction makes that, I don't know, that the narrator of a certain novel is asserting or asking a question or doing something like that. So what happened in this case, at least in my opinion, that is what I'm trying to defend in my PhD, is that George Lucas fiction made that Obi-Wan was lying, was making an insincere assertion to Luke. That's the answer I can give to you. I don't know if I can argue about it now. I'm trying to argue about it from the past 3 years. It has some problems.
No, thank you. That's interesting.
Thank you for the questions.
Hannah?
Great. Thanks for the talk. Lots going on. Lots of questions, but I'll just choose one for now, which is just, it seems that central to your case is that we lack reliable and access to the author's intention or overt intention, right? So that's why we can never be sure whether there's genuine assertion in a work. So my question is, why doesn't this worry also infect our ability to detect genuine speech acts of the fiction-making kind, right? Because you also define that in terms of intention, right? It's like intention to get people to imagine things and not believe maybe. And so why is it that lack of access to intention only affects assertion and not fiction making if you spell both out in terms of intention?
Yeah. So that's a problem. I actually been thinking about, but I don't know how to characterize an insincere act of fiction making, which seems to be an act of where the author lacks actual imagination or doesn't think it's true in fiction that the content of his act is true in fiction. Actually, I'm defining imagination as truth in fiction. To imagine something is to take something as truth in fiction. So, I know it's problematic, but I saw your talk yesterday. I know it's problematic, but that's what I have to do. That's what Curry does most of the time. So, and then trying to extend Curry's approach to speech act. That's why I'm broadly Grecian. So I don't know what is an insincere act of fiction making. We could think about like when the author was trying to create a fiction, like before publishing it or something like that, before making it public. He was trying to do something and then he made an act of fiction making. He'd say that, oh, it's true in fiction that Frodo has more than, I don't know, 6 fingers. And then Tolkien was like, oh no, this is going to be bad. It's not true in fiction anymore. So we could say that he was making an insincere act of fiction making. But I don't know how exactly it would impact in actual published works, because the canon is somewhat set in stone, you know?
So something like autofiction comes to mind, where like you just describe something that feels like you're just describing your life. So think of like Nosgard, My Struggles, where it seems almost like insincere fiction making because anybody who picks it up without context is going to think it's just autobiography. But anyway, we should talk more about it during break. I know there's a queue.
Oh, I hope. Thank you.
Andre?
Oh, it's my turn. Okay. Are you hearing me?
Yes, Andre.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Iago, for your presentation. I believe that the approach by the speech act theory is the correct one. I'm trying to do something like that too.
Oh, thank you. Great hearing that from a student from Van der Wecken.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're using Van der Wecken too. I've been 15 years an assistant of research of Van der Wecken, like in my country, in Quebec. Okay, but I have to say that I'm quite skeptical about the existence of a sui generis illocutionary force of fiction making. The illocutionary force determines conditions of success and satisfaction, and it is far from clear what would be the condition of success and satisfaction of a speech act of making of fiction making. As to the lying in fiction, of course, Shakespeare or Conan Doyle never had the intention to fool their readers. This is not what they are doing has nothing to do with lies. The only example I found in a standard work of fiction is the preface of The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. In the preface is part of the work of fiction. And in the preface, you can read something like, "Dear reader, we want to assure you that what follows, there is nothing fictional in what follows, etc., etc." So That seems to be clearly a lie in the work of fiction. But in standard works of fiction, the authors clearly do not have the intention to deceive their readers. And as to the belief expressed, Frege and Gareth Evans, when he is interpreting Frege, use the word mock belief. A genuine belief is a belief that on which you can form projects. If I believe that in that glass, the water in that glass has been poisoned, I can form different projects, committed suicide, or killing someone, offering the water, or to pour the contents of the glass in the sink in order to avoid an accident, a tragedy, or to call the cop for an investigation. These are genuine beliefs. That would be a genuine belief. But the belief expressed in a standard work of fiction are not of this kind. These are not beliefs on which we can form projects, on which you would act as an agent, you know. A last observation, the assertions in a work of fictions superficially are not different from the assertion in a newspaper, a biography, or a contract. The utterance acts are the same. They are both or can be equal, but the effect is not the same. So I think perlocutionary intentions must be considered in the whole analysis. I believe you are on the right track, but I disagree on some points. Okay, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your considerations. Do I have time to make some observations about the observations, Ito?
Sure. Go ahead.
For sure. Okay. So José, who's managing the table. So thank you, André. I really enjoy your work. To be completely true with you, you're the one who first recommended me to start reading about philosophy of fiction in, I don't know, 2015 in a Principia. Oh. It's been some time. I was an undergrad at the time. So I think the idea which comes especially from Searle, the logical status of fictional discourse about serious use if we have an actual speech act of fiction making. I don't know if I have a way to circumvent Searle's argument completely. I think he's making good points. The way I'm trying to argue for the necessity of a sui generis speech act of fiction making is specifying the effects of the act of fiction making. I'm trying to use Stonecker's model of speech act, of assertion, and trying to build up on Stonecker's model how fiction making is distinct or different from other speech acts, how the effects on the context that an act of fiction making are distinct from the effects on the context of an act of assertion or an act of questioning. And I think we have some striking distinct features. And I think that this is, I think, a way to argue for the necessity of a sui generis speech act. Like, they are so distinct that we have no reason to suppose that it is a sui generis speech act. This is how I'm doing. I will not have a formal proof. I will not have a knockout argument. I will just say that we're better. It's somewhat like an inference to the best explanation. Like, it is the best explanation for this distinct effects is that we have a sui generis effect. This is what I'm trying to do. So it is quite liberal. So I need to specify a lot of things. So I will not try to, but I'll happily talk to Marco to invite you to something, to Marco Fino to invite you to something, so we can talk about this in a more timely fashion. And about Robinson Crusoe or corner cases, this is a problem. I don't know how to do with it. I'm mainly working with things that are actually fiction, and we have no doubt about the fictional status of that work. We're not in doubt about if the author was trying to lie or trying to deceive someone. I'm trying to work with known corner cases, like works of fiction that are actually fiction. No one has doubt about the fictionality of the act or the work or something like that. So Robinson Crusoe, and if it is a lie or a work of fiction, I will throw my project out of the window when this question came. Because I don't know how to answer them. I don't know what to do with them. I hope to know one day, but right now I can't do it. But thank you again for the considerations, really.
Okay. So thank you, Iago. Thank you, everybody who made questions in this session. I'll stop the